at later stage of marriage. Let's see what that pops up.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
shares
oxytocin, of course. Yeah.
oxytocin, known as the love hormone, provokes feelings of contentment, calmness, and security, which are often associated with mate bonding. Vasopressin
Vasopressin. Yeah.
is linked to behavior that produce long-term monogamous relationship. Wow, that's so interesting. I had no idea about that. I was talking with a friend of mine the other day, and he was sharing with me. He's not a doctor. He's he's a DJ. So he was sharing with me. He's like, I have this theory that everyone in any kind of relationship just fell out of love over time. And it's up to you to maintain a romantic relationship. Otherwise, it won't last. It's just like something you need to do in order to help it survive. And would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's interesting that the one thing people will often say is, well, it takes work, you know,
Oh,
and I've heard that, and I, in the very sense you were just describing, it's like, yeah, you have to give some conscious effort to that, or it might slip away. Uh, it's funny because I don't like to think of it in terms of it taking work in the sense of unpleasant work. It takes conscious effort, but you know, when you're doing something you love, for most people, I think, I guess, is kind of a definition of doing something you love. When you're doing something, you have a lot of fun. I'm just any kind of activity, you know, I love to do X, Y, or Z, you know, that usually means it's not hard work to put in the effort to make time to do that. It feels like a reward. And when a relationship is going well, the work of nurturing it feels like its own reward. It just feels good. You keep getting these positive vibes back from your partner, and you know your partner keeps getting positive vibes back from you. It's self-reinforcing. So it doesn't feel like hard work. It just feels like joy.
yeah.
But I think you know what your friend was pointing out is very true. That yeah, it's a couple that is doing well. This is here's another one of my favorite themes here. You know, if you look at how couples are doing well, this applies to communication, by the way, too. If you look at a couple that is doing well, they will be doing things in certain characteristic ways. You know, the stuff we've just been talking about. You'll see that they are making romantic gestures toward each other, usually. You know, you'll see that they are communicating in ways that are mutually respectful. You'll see that they can handle disagreements gracefully. You'll see they can handle disappointments gracefully. Couples that do well are doing that. And there's a guy named John Gottman who you may have heard of because he's really well known. Anytime people are talking about couples therapy, they will often mention John Gottman's work because he's a researcher out in Seattle in the United States and in the state of Washington. And he's been studying couples for decades now. I think he's well into his 80s, if I'm not mistaken. And his most famous research involved bringing in newlywed couples, interviewing them separately and together. And one of the things he would do is bring them into the same room and ask them to talk about something they disagree about. And he would, of course, videotape this conversation. So he followed those same couples, would bring them in every few years for, in some cases, like 25 years. What do you do if you follow a bunch of couples for 25 years? Well, you're going to discover some of them broke up. Some of them are still together and happy about it. Some of them are still together, but not so happy about it. Well, then he would go back and look at the newlywed data. What do we see in the newlywed data that might have predicted how they turned out? And he's a real kind of, you know, nerdy statistical type guy like me, which I can kind of relate to that. You know, I'm an old nerdy statistical guy myself. And so he just let the data speak for itself. He said, well, all right, let's see what these groups look like in terms of those videotape conversations. And he discovered a number of things. And one of the things that what called it to mind in terms of what we were just talking about is one of the things he discovered was it didn't make any difference how many differences they had going in. In other words, there were couples that had lots of differences going in that did well or split up. There were couples that had few differences going in that did well or split up. That doesn't seem to make any difference. What did make a difference, and this part isn't terribly surprising, what did make a difference is how they handled those differences. And when he looked at those conversations in the newlyweds, how they talked about those differences was very predictive about how they were going to turn out later on as newlyweds. The couples, it was interesting, the gender differences he found among heterosexual couples. He found that in the heterosexual couples that he was studying, the large majority of the time, it was the woman who brought up the problem to be talked about. usually, I think it was like 80%, that didn't differentiate between and how they turned out at all. That was true across the board. Not that surprising because it's usually in a heterosexual couple, women want to talk about stuff before men do. That's more or less, again, it's not 100%, but more or less that's the tendency. So that didn't predict anything, but how she brought up the problem was highly predictive of how the couple was going to do. If she brought up the problem by tearing him a new one, in other words, if she was pissed off before she even got started, they were in trouble. If she was respectful in how she brought it up, she didn't have to be wimpy about it. She could be assertive, but if she was clear and respectful, if she's saying, well, there is something I want to bring up. It's not the end of the world, but there's something I'd like to bring up. You open to that? That predicted success. Now, it wasn't, of course, only up to the woman, because what dovetails neatly with that was the other thing he found. The couples that did well, the man frequently accepted influence from the woman. What did he mean by that? He just meant that when she brought up the problem, he showed clearly he wanted to hear it. He was open to hearing it. It didn't mean he agreed with her. He wasn't saying yes, dear. That can be kind of condescending. It wasn't that. It was just that if she said, hey, there's a problem I want to discuss, he was saying, absolutely, I want to hear. And he genuinely listened. That was predictive of success. And you can see how those two things fit together so nicely, because if her habitual experience of him is that he listens when she brings something up, she's not pissed off when she starts. She's confident when she starts. She can be respectful and confident because she says, well, he's going to listen, so we'll get someplace. If, on the other hand, he stonewalls or puts her down or, just doesn't want to listen, then she's pissed off before she starts and they're in trouble. So all of those things have to do with how a couple is doing when they're doing well. Now, this is the part that I touched on in that book. It's not about communication. What do therapists do with this information? Well, they'll say, oh, good, let's look at how couples that are doing well communicate, and then tell people to communicate like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
It makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Except that it's a logical fallacy.
Oh, no.
And I love pointing this out, right? So you play tennis? I mean, I hardly ever play tennis, but I used to with my kids long ago. You know what tennis is, obviously. You've seen tennis, right? Yeah. Ever see
I know tennis.
Rafa, ever see Rafa play tennis? I guess he just recently retired, didn't he? Rafael Nadal. And he, among many other pros, when he hits the ball, he grunts loudly. He does this big loud grunt when he hits the ball, right?
Yeah.
Most of the pros seem to do that. So what this tells me is that I, as a not a very skilled tennis player, if I just grunt loudly, I'll be a good tennis player, right?
I guess. I mean, no, of course not. It doesn't make any difference. You need a technique.
No.
Yeah.
No, imitating